Menacingly, the doctor smiled. Walking past room after room of the sick, like some sort of awful freak show. The numbers on the doors get all shuffled up in my mind. I get dizzy. I get confused. An old man has suffered a massive stroke in his left hemisphere and no longer can understand any language. His wife must go through agonizing pantomime to convince him of her good intentions, as having blood on the brain for so long caused severe retrograde and lesser anterograde amnesia, so he can't remember having married her and has to be reminded somehow he is in a hospital today, just like yesterday. Yes, there was a yesterday. Just like tomorrow. Yes, by sorrow, there will be one of those as well. In the next room there is John Doe, who fluctuates so violently between insomnia without any paradoxical sleep for days and narcolepsy, where he dozes off chewing and falls immediately into nightmares, collapsing on the spot, only to awaken to hallucinations and or brief paralysis. He is being tested hourly by two young electroencephalographists eager to study the effects of such aberrant spurts of consciousness in the form of electrical impulses from the cerebral cortex, alpha waves almost constantly while awake, with beta waves spiking immediately before and after his tragic attacks, fits even, of sleep. On the development and maintenance of what would be a healthy limbic system, if not for the greatly varied hormone production rates and the resultant degradation of the cerebellum and brainstem, which these two ambitious whitecoats have recorded. John Doe is, according to their sterile calculations, slowly but irreversibly degenerating into anxiety-ridden schizophrenia, and will eventually require institutionalization. But you should see his paintings, mostly done while in a state of spontaneous somnambulism, or under conditions of induced hypnotism or half-conscious trance, when his brain seems to be both awake and asleep at the exact same moment, an astounding event for which the two doctors have no hypothetical cause, but a certain apprehension of its dangerous political psychic implications. In another room, two leprous patients with Ebola copulate with the desperation unique to the dying, screaming more out of pain than masochistic pleasure as the chemical weapon burns away their tender living hides. As I listen with annoyance to orderlies administering them their daily devil's pinches, I read over the chart of John Doe. Fascinating findings in regard to the light-dark sensitive pineal gland's increased secretion of melatonin, or as René Descartes called it, the soul. The hypothalamus is also being affected, affecting in turn all the other endocrine glands and hormone production by way of the uncontrolled pituitary's lack of regulative ability. The adrenal glands are dousing the blood-brain barrier with salt, while the pancreas is saturating the cerebellum with sugar. So much increased hormone production in a circulatory environment already quickened by night terrors to 150 beats per minute was, in addition to a depletion of the neurotransmitter serotonin, also linked to memory, replenished by the delta waves of now absent deep NREM sleep, enough to cause severe mania even in someone with comparably healthy sleeping patterns. The two patients in the next room have quieted down now to the new torment of a mild basic sponge bath on all their opened and inflamed sores. I move by another room in which a man with gigantism, restrained by several orderlies, is hollering for laudanum to quell the awful growing pains brought on by his sluggish, blue-blooded hemophilia, "I can't take it no more," cries the African junkie, and hurls an orderly through the 10th-story window like a little girl flinging a rag doll. Further along the corridor, I hear a whitecoat telling an 80-year-old man in for surgical removal of recurrent prepuce and summary, that is courtesy, rectal examination and elective cleansing, that the testicles must dangle about outside the abdominal cavity because sperm is like revenge in that they are both best served cold, among other things. A little boy is having a stomach pump for mistaking the jack-o'-lantern mushroom for the chanterelle mushroom. His mother is scolding him by telling him a story about Jean-Louis Agassiz, fish, brains, phosphorus, books, and covers. A sailor who is habitually undernourished with vitamin D is a deformed mess on the foot of a bed, bones melted like Dali's clocks and solidified in bent, misshapen squiggles. High-powered antibiotic enemas are administered in an attempt to cleanse cirrhosis in a corset-wearing woman dressed in mid-19th century garb. Apparently, the whalebone has so constricted her innards that penetration of ingestible laxatives, administered more as a psychological deterrent than as a medical corrective, is impossible in the conventional order, and besides, an expert remarks to me unprompted, the Malays will never expect an affront on its flanks from behind. Adam's apples are implanted surgically for sheer aesthetic in people who have had their thyroids removed and now suffer from allergic rhinitis at the sight of a staring eyeball. Impatient babies are fit for far-sighted corrective spectacles. Eggheads suffering from kyphosis as their spine telescopes, like in Alice in Wonderland, line up for treatment of psychological malocclusion, for which they are exposed to socialization such as the form of Scientology practiced in The Clockwork Orange. Sufferers of this treatment pour right back in, complaining of clenching in the thermomandibular joint of the jaw, the same awful headaches they initially came in to be treated for. And these two lines form a figure 8, as naked apes take the sneetch cure, something akin to going snipe hunting in Lemuria. Some hip humanists have their epidermis removed, strutting about in nude muscle tissue, only to have it all grow back within a week as a smooth, skinny keloid blob of formless scar tissue. Karl Langer von Edinburgh rolls around in his coffin restlessly. After a long ride up in a glass elevator, being x-rayed for weapons and detoxed of all bacteria in a burning shower of antiprotons, I finally come to the office of the Executor General. I find Zone 51's Surgeon Prime putting golf balls into a miniature green made of an AstroTurf throw rug and a generously yawning plastic rictus. He is wearing a broad-rimmed, flat, stern-looking Spanish hat above a long-beaked bird mask of smooth, plain leather. Long, priestly robes, all vertically cut, no Greek diagonals. I sway suddenly, becoming lightheaded and tired. My hand nearly leaves my side as I teeter in disorientation, and my brain races wildly to recall the direction of the exit. Why does this have to happen in the presence of authority? I collect myself rapidly, still distracted by the curiosity as to whether this outburst was caused by the stress of presentation or the fear of the bad news inevitably brought by such men as he whom I now stand before. I take a quick, deep breath and begin my pitch. "Doctor," I choke and cough for several seconds, becoming dizzy again and beginning to sweat. I begin again, with even less confidence, and I listen with impotent detachment to my voice, which sounds like the pubescent voice of a perverse little boy. Doctor, as you know, I have come about the plans I discussed with you through more impersonal correspondence. Plans which will benefit the industry you represent as well as that of which I am here on behalf. Plans, Doctor, to integrate the circulatory systems of the biological automobile and its human driver. At first, being a long-standing Mason, he protests, but he begins to see reason the more I convince him that the vampiric necessity of sacrifice for gain, upon which society was built and maintained, would carry over intact, even simplified. Look, says I, why should the common man work so hard to turn his life's blood into money, and then his money into gasoline? He isn't really consenting to such blatant enslavement for the money or for the gasoline. He does this willingly, out of selfishness even. He sees it as a means to an end which the car realizes for him, that end being freedom. He already sees the car as an extension of his body, hence our making them as organic as pets, but as mindless as the lesser races, a living tool. His living tool, for which he is willing to be our living tool. Combine both and cut corners. Money, gas, only means to a psychic end now on the physical horizon. Man as 70-mile-per-hour cockroach. A long silence follows, during which time I swallow hard more than the situation can reasonably tolerate. My hands have sunk into hiding within the loose pockets of my trousers, and my toes are jostling and rubbing against one another in the sweltering claustrophobic caverns of my shoes. I feel my pounding temples gaining distance between each burning beat of my pulse, leaving me alternating between jungle-like pressure and Arctic chills. I watch with tension to the point of horror as the Inquisitor glides over to behind his desk and shrinks down into the contoured seat. His long-fingered hands, almost skeletal, sheathed in tight black latex gloves, emerge and slide delicately over the keyboard of his WorldNet console, accessing data on what? On production codes? Running probability scenarios on randomizing access generators? Looking up my personal file? How? His voice is so artificial. He must have a vocal cord supplemental. Well, what we were considering was a direct biosymbiosis between Otto and driver, actively established by the cabin tissue at the permeation of the cockpit's orifice. It could be triggered by a chemical reaction activated within the folds of the membranous lips when they sensed an object being pushed through them. Our model was the erection of clitoral tissue aroused by the prolonged penetration of the nymphi, sir. What we propose developing is a pair of stingers near the right arm console within the passenger cavity, able to actively seek and pierce the right radial artery. The flow of the serum through the intravenous would then be established by the beating of the driver's own heart, and the blood, once cycled entirely through the vascular network of the car, would be returned for oxygenation through the second stinger, which would insert itself into the long cephalous vein inside the driver's right ankle. As the car's velocity, or rather the effort of its motion, increases, the rate of blood flow necessary to sustain its functions increases, and preliminary tests have shown the heart reacts to this as if it were a natural exertion of its own body, pumping blood faster. Although several of the high-endurance experiments culminated in heart failure or internal hemorrhage, and one admittedly in subject explosion, it has been proven sufficiently for market regulations that an increase of too great a speed or of too overwhelming a propulsion will merely result in a vasovagal response not unlike spontaneous unconsciousness. In other words, fainting. The new limit this constriction of blood flow would place on potential vehicle velocity may be overcome in the long run by the addition of a deep breathing mask, providing the lungs with air at the force of the wind outside the car, literally flooding them with the amount of oxygen necessary to sustain heightened levels of blood pressure. And in the event of a crash, will the subject, that is, the consumer, survive to buy a replacement car, or will they bleed to death if unintentionally disconnected? Well, in the event of separation, the stingers are designed to secrete the same nerve-deadening, wound-closing agent present in the stylites of the mosquito. The crash, however, Doctor, as you must yourself well know, is a statistical improbability. The organic car is given enough basic instinct that in a collision situation it would act to preserve itself and avoid danger. Besides this, the reinforced steel skeleton would keep the occupants well secured within the primary body cavity, even in the unlikely event of high-speed impact. The car looks out for the driver's safety now, so the designers of our new system took for granted a finite degree of latitude in drafting the rapid withdrawal apparatus. To tell you the truth, I would expect the driver to go into shock if he were to be removed for... Yes. And what else? Well, Doctor, I could still point out the advantages of the joint circulatory approach to organic car, how shall we say, oppression. They cannot develop the sentience to revolt if they, like mechanical cars, are only activated by the presence of their owner, and only allowed active consciousness for the duration of their usage. That is no longer of concern. Why? What? It was of utmost importance at last month's annual eugenics conference. It was the key issue. It was concluded that the perfect car could not be grown until the issue of their burgeoning self-awareness as free entities was alleviated. How in that span of time could a viable solution be formulated? Need we remind you that it is not your place to beg such questions of us? My heart freezes into a fist of dry ice, and I can feel the warmth drop out of my body. No, sir, I apologize, sir. It is of little consequence. We intended to reveal it to you regardless. It is the price for your company sharing its technology with ours. We will now show you what we have been developing. One of his bony digits lurches down against the plastic surface of the table, and a light appears beneath it. The plexiglass wall behind him begins to darken as an automatic chemical reaction releases tonal pigment through a system of invisible tubes gridded throughout the clear, impervious subatomic mesh. Even as it darkens, an image begins to coalesce on its surface, and as the natural light wanes, the artificial glow of a live broadcast fills the office with dim colors. A factory floor appears and takes focus. On it, there are the familiar gestation tanks and birthing chambers of the biological automobiles, white-coated techno-physicians roaming the concrete hatchery, inputting notes on computer wafers. The camera gradually begins to pan downward and close in on the body of a specific car, which appears to be about 9 weeks old, almost mature. The doctor narrates as I tune uninterestedly into the transmission that looms before me in full buzzing artificial reality. For several years now, we have been developing something that should put an end entirely to any further fears of revolution by the living cars. We did not mention it at the convention in the same way you did not mention your little innovation. Nobody mentions anything in public. No one who knows anything at all ever has. Now then, here you may begin to see the modification we mentioned. What I am looking at is a system of tentacles dangling down from the ceiling of the interior of the car's passenger hold, the camera having slipped in through the driver's side orifice, which is being held agape by an enormous speculum, apparently causing the restrained Otto a great deal of pain. What? I begin to ask even as the doctor cuts me off with the answer. It is a method of interconnecting the car's and the driver's nervous systems. Essentially the same premise as your circulatory sharing mechanism, though more direct in its method of control, and lacking, sadly, the economic applicability of your company's design. It is, however, well underway in its manufacture, and so far showing vast improvement in the disposition of those automobiles modified with the new autonomic system. Those cars who are now being made already have it, and all cars on the market will want to have it too. How does it work? I stammer in awe. Very simple. An involuntary weave of nerves, treated with a natural tranquilizing agent, reacts to the assumption of an occupant by penetrating their nape above multiple nerve centers. The nerves grow together at the molecular level, effectively bonding both the CNS and the PNS of the subject and vessel. On the cellular level, axons and dendrites of the nerve trunk intermingle with those of the uppermost thoracic spinal nerves, essentially making the nerve trunk like a 30-second spinal nerve. The two entities are actually sharing pre- and post-synaptic cells. Synapses link the trunk to both the car and the driver like an umbilical cord links a fetus to the womb of its mother. But in this case, the motor control flows from inside out, in addition to sense data flowing outside in, rather than a relationship of only nutrition flowing outside in. The fact that the bond would necessarily be two-way, with the motor neurons being primarily of human structure, and the sensory neurons being primarily comprised of the automobile's tissue, afferent and efferent in one shared structure, means that the car would act as a part of the human's actual body, and the human would feel the sensations experienced by the visceral dermis of the car. They would be completely inseparable in this state, poised as they are on the brink of a bouton. The Schwann cells, the myelin sheath, the nodes of Ranvier, saltatory conduction. It all occurs as though the car were merely an outgrowth of the natural body. Tests have proven beyond doubt that the automotive and Homo sapien neurotransmitters are as compatible as those of any two vertebrae. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine for skeletal and behavioral posturing, even dopamine for a relaxed sensation of high-speed euphoria while in motion, thus increasing the already impressive amounts of alpha waves emitted by the brain watching the world through a windshield. Just imagine how dreamlike billboard advertisements could become. How subversively subliminal. Doctor, what you're talking about here is more than just advanced transportation. It's a whole new form of communication, breaking down the barriers of self between sentient beings. We know. Isn't it wonderful? Whole new habituations may be expected to arise in time as a result of this evolutionary breakthrough. Never before conceived of reflex arcs will form. The already existing beta blockers available to manipulate the sympathetic neuron secreted neurotransmitter norepinephrine, you might know it by its street name, noradrenaline, and the parasympathetic neuron secreted acetylcholine to strengthen or slow the heartbeat, respectively, even have implications on your company's project, do they not? Indeed, you see that the financial as well as scientific potential is limitless. What's good for Darwinism is good for social Darwinism, they say. I look over at the doctor, who is almost too exuberant to contain himself. In the twilight of the intense, microscopic zoom shot on the monitor, I can vaguely make out an organelle jutting up from the doctor's lap, pink and bare, where his cassock has been flung asunder. It is reaching out like a baby's handless arm or a charmed snake, like a straining snail toward the screen. I take my leave. for a moment, within the glass elevator, sucking me, swallowing me down like a gelatinous capsule into the dyspeptic stomach of the hospital. I collapse against the transparent wall and sink to the transparent floor, so dizzy and queasy and weightless, finally allowing myself to be overcome by the anguish that surrounds me everywhere and all the time in this most sick and wonderful of all possible worlds.